Hello, I'm Peter Okwacha. Welcome to Focus on Africa. Our top stories. A grim milestone in Africa's fight against coronavirus. We're on the cusp of 500,000 confirmed cases across the continent. Is it a fight we're winning, or are low testing numbers hiding the true extent of the outbreak? We'll have a reality check on that. As infections rise and restrictions ease, we'll look at how coronavirus is currently impacting tourism in Kenya and education in Uganda. Also on the program, who owns history? We join the BBC's Clive Myrie as he traces his past and that of his ancestors in Bristol, the British city where last month a statue of slave trader Edward Colston was torn down by Black Lives Matter protesters angry at its colonial past. Thanks for joining us here on Focus on Africa from BBC World News. We start the show with a bleak picture of how coronavirus has run rampant across the globe since the start of the year, and Africa in particular. We're only a few thousand infections away from 500,000 confirmed cases on the continent. South Africa today passed the 200,000 mark, and Nigeria is staring down the barrel of 30,000 infections. And all this on a day when WHO officials admitted for the first time that evidence is emerging to suggest airborne transmission of COVID-19 virus. More than 11.5 million people worldwide have been infected since the pandemic began. That's according to Johns Hopkins University in the United States. Just over 500,000 of them have died. Across Africa, despite rising infection rates, countries are beginning to ease lockdown measures amid fears that economies will be dealt knockout blows. So what's really going on? Rhoda Odhiambo has this reality check.
Africa still accounts for less than 3% of worldwide COVID-19 cases, but cases here are still rising and rising fast. According to the Africa Center for Disease Control, it took Africa 98 days to record 100,000 cases and only 18 days to reach 200,000 cases. Cases now stand at around 500,000. You may be wondering how and why. Well, first, there is widespread community transmission in 30 of the 47 sub-Saharan African countries, which means that the virus is circulating within the population. Secondly, testing. When Africa reported the first case in February 13th, only Senegal, South Africa, and Egypt were able to test for COVID-19. But with the support from the WHO and Africa CDC, member states now have the capacity to test for the virus. Countries like South Africa, Nigeria, Algeria, Ghana, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Senegal, and Kenya are the top 10 countries with high numbers of COVID-19 cases. Some of this has been attributed to increased testing. In countries like South Africa, Ghana, and Gabon, healthcare workers are going out into the community looking for asymptomatic cases. Others are conducting targeted testing in areas where clusters of cases have been reported and have also decentralized testing outside the big cities. But many countries in Africa still lack adequate supply of test kits. Critics worry that there are large numbers of COVID-19 cases going unreported, but the regional director for WHO, Dr. Matshidiso Moeti, said there is a certain degree and we cannot quantify it
of underestimation of the number of cases. But we do not think that there are many which are undetected and people are dying unknown of COVID-19 in African countries.
So hopefully, not so bad. Lockdown measures across the continent have probably helped slow the spread by keeping people far away from each other. The lockdowns also bought time for countries trying to improve their surveillance capabilities. But the economic impact of this pandemic has hit Africa hard. From manufacturing to airlines to tourism, Africa's economies have lost billions in the past 4 months. Countries are now starting to ease lockdown restrictions. And as people start to move again, expect to see Africa's cases continue to rise. How much they will rise will be determined by the continent's readiness to find, test, isolate, and treat every case.
Ruda Odhiambo there. Well, across the world, people use traditional home remedies to heal themselves. At the start of this pandemic, the president of Madagascar promoted a herbal drink produced from Artemisia plant that he claimed could cure the virus. That claim wasn't backed by the WHO, and the Malagasy capital, Antananarivo, is back in lockdown following a spike in cases and deaths. Our South Africa correspondent Nomsama Seko now shares her story of growing up drinking the herb and discussing how it is used in her own community.
This is my childhood kitchen. This is where I grew up. And in my family, this is how we prepare lingana. We call it in isiZulu, umhlonyane. It brings back memories of my youth. My mom used to threaten me that if I didn't drink this when I had a cold, she wouldn't take me to the zoo. So you can imagine as a child that I reluctantly had to drink this. When the COVID-19 pandemic took hold, the president of Madagascar announced that lingana could cure the disease, a claim the World Health Organization has cautioned against. But it's meant the demand for the plant has skyrocketed. Even my mother has had most of the plant stolen from her garden. This little bit is what's left of it. Just a few minutes from my house is this market that sells traditional medicine.
Umhlonyana cishe and then ngina 48 years in Twasile. Kule 48 years in Twasile and ndibe ngisonsa wona. Esifana nomhlonyana ukukhwehlela nomkhuhlane. Nguthole vele bewusebenzisa obaba, ngithabona. And then nami ngafika ngawusebenzisa. Since iqalile lento abantu bayeza. Yeah. Bayeza mayiphelile nto yeodeni or uhamba entabeni uyoyikha njengolwazi lapho.
So ungasho nje ukuthi mhlambe ngelanga uthengisela abantu abangaki?
Kungenzeka ngelanga kuya ngokuthi bangakanani abantu babe nothando ukuzofuna lonto leyo. Kungenzeka bafike ku50, kungenzeka bafike ku60, kungenzeka bafike ku70, ngithabona. Babu
Gumede says he'll continue prescribing lingana to his clients, but health professionals say there's no scientific evidence to back up his claim.
We have heard and seen the excitement around umhlonyana plant, also known as Artemisia afra. What I think has made it particularly popular this year is the fact that we are dealing with a current COVID-19 pandemic. There is currently no evidence scientifically that supports its use for the treatment of COVID-19.
Like many places around the world, we all have our own home remedies and we cling to them, whether or not they work.
Well, as we heard earlier in the program, the hospitality industry around the world is one of the hardest hit by COVID-19. Hotels, restaurants and cafes have all been closed to prevent a spread. In Kenya, some are now slowly reopening, but under strict government restrictions. The current health and safety protocols put in place effectively reduce number of guests and even staff they can have in place. The BBC's Mercy Juma looks at how major hotels in Nairobi are coming back and their survival game plans.
After months of empty rooms, no guests, and staff either laid off or sent home on half pay, the hotel industry in Kenya is slowly picking up again. 3 months after temporarily closing, one of the country's most luxurious hotels, the Villa Rosa Kempinski, just opened the doors to one of its 3 restaurants. There's no more buffet service and operations have changed, from signage everywhere for people to social distance, several sanitation points, temperature checks, and the use of gloves and masks.
I think it will take to go back to normality 18 months. To go back at the volume of 2019. Everyone, the common consensus is to have a 2021 to rebuild the business, and 2022 to go back at the volume pre-COVID.
While large hotels like the Kempinski have enough space to comply with the safety regulations, many others do not. The 1.5 meters distance between one table to the other and 1 meter between people reduces seating capacity, and lower capacity means less revenue.
For stakeholders in this industry, the top priority right now is survival.
The Sarova Pan-Africa is a 5-star hotel in Nairobi. It's repurposed 80 rooms into office spaces that can be hired during the day, targeting business executives not able to work from home.
So with the Serenity, I'm able to cover a lot more in this space as opposed to home because of the minimal distractions. So I actually like it. I can do it maybe once or twice a week just to get a lot more done.
So far, Kenya has lost 50% of total annual tourism earnings due to the coronavirus pandemic. That's about $810 million based on last year's revenues.
This is a health issue, so it's important that we play our part. So, of course, things like social distancing, things like wearing face masks, things like personal hygiene, those are very, very important. But for an industry like ours, where you need to travel to enjoy the products, we cannot operate in a situation where we are on lockdown. It's just not sustainable for us. We're burning a lot of cash. Cash flow right now is the only metric that we're looking at as businesses.
Players agree that product innovation, good pricing for the domestic market product, and gaining the trust of travelers through prioritizing their health and campaigns is probably the only way to reassure the world that Kenya is safe. Mercy Juma, BBC News, Nairobi.
Let's take a quick look at other stories making the headlines across Africa and the rest of the world now. The head of Nigeria's Anti-Corruption Commission has been suspended by President Muhammadu Buhari as he faces allegations of corruption. Ibrahim Magu, who has been in charge of the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, or EFCC, since 2015, was questioned for a second day today by a presidential panel investigating the allegations. According to local sources, Mr. Magu is being questioned over property holdings and the alleged transfer of funds abroad through a third party. The U.S. Immigration Agency has said that foreign students will not be allowed to stay in the country if their universities change to online courses. Many universities have moved courses online because of the coronavirus pandemic, but it's not clear how many students will be affected. Tens of thousands of African students study in the U.S. each year. And Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro has tested positive for COVID-19. He took the test, his fourth, on Monday after developing symptoms, including a high temperature. Mr. Bolsonaro has repeatedly played down the risks posed by the virus, calling it a little flu and saying that he would not be seriously affected by it. Brazil currently has the second highest number of cases in the world after the US. This is Focus on Africa from BBC World News with me, Peter Okwoche. Still to come, after the toppling of a slave trader's statue in the English city of Bristol, we report on the shape of Britain's colonial legacy today. I'm Peter Okwoche. Welcome back. The coronavirus pandemic has had a devastating impact on education across African countries. With lockdowns in place, the future of millions of pupils remain in the balance. In Uganda, teachers too are feeling the blow. Most of them teach in privately owned schools and their incomes are dependent on the fees paid by their students. But with schools shut, salaries are not forthcoming. The BBC's Patience Atuaire reports from Kampala.
Yiga's entire family's livelihood depends on this poetry project. He was already one of the poorest paid professionals in the country. He worked 6 days a week teaching in 3 different schools and earning about $200 a month. Due to the lockdown, he hasn't been able to work since March and life has become tougher.
We have foregone some of the meals as we manage to get the breakfast, the lunch before we go eat, and then we have supper late in the evening. But for the little children, we give them something little. For the adults, we can survive.
The situation is dire for the private education sector at all levels across the country. This nursery school section would have been bustling with about 100 children, but their classrooms and equipment are now gathering dust.
By the time we closed, the fees collections were not actually even 80%. And so there is no way that the school can improvise. We have no option but to just keep holding on and see what comes along.
I'm a good friend.
The public school system in the country only begins at age 6. Therefore, all nursery schools are run by the private sector. As months of the lockdown roll on, the education of about 3 million children in pre-primary faces an uncertain future.
The government warned against laying off of employees during this time, but school owners do not want to keep teachers on payroll and accumulate months of unpaid salaries. So some have been laying them off anyway, with the promise that if things normalize, they will be considered for rehiring.
In many areas across Uganda, private schools are established where there are no public institutions. But with many facing uncertain times, millions of children may have no school to return to. Patience Atweire, BBC News, Kampala.
Let's move away from COVID-19 a bit now. And an uneasy calm remains across most of Ethiopia today, following anti-government protests last week in which more than 166 people were killed. The violence was sparked by the killing of a popular pro-reform Oromo musician, Hakalu Hundisa. The capital Addis Ababa and other hotspots remain closely guarded by security forces, and a blanket internet shutdown is now in its 6th day. And as the BBC's Kalkidan Yibeltal reports from Addis, there's also been a crackdown on dissidents and media houses.
Ethiopia is still reeling from last week's violence that saw scores killed. The internet remains shut down, blocking the flow of information, which means that we still don't know how much damage has been incurred. But as days go by, more and more horror stories in which some appear to have been targeted due to their ethnicity or religion are emerging. Local authorities in some of these areas have said that security forces had been overwhelmed. Dozens have now been arrested, including some prominent political figures, as authorities vow to bring to justice not only those that are behind the killing of the musician Hachalu Hundessa, but also those that were involved in the violence that followed. Authorities accuse some media houses of fanning ethnic tensions, and 3 TV stations are already under investigation. One of these TV stations and another one from the northern region of Tigray are taken off air. This will likely increase the tension between the federal government in Addis Ababa and the government of Tigray in the north. Here in the capital, calm has returned and things are back to normal. But in parts of the country, tensions remain high. Kalkidan Yibeltal, BBC News, Addis Ababa.
Now, recent protests by the Black Lives Matter movement and controversy over public statues has drawn attention to aspects of Britain's imperial past and its legacy. In the first of a series of reports from around the world, my colleague Clive Myrie has been to the city of Bristol, where the statue of the slave trader Edward Colston was pulled down by protesters and thrown into a harbour on June the 7th. Clive takes a look at how Britain's colonial legacy is reflected today.
Who owns history? Who dictates memory? Is it always the victors?
What would you think about coloured people coming to work on the buses?
I don't like the idea very much.
What about the others? Those marginalised, like the Windrush generation?
You know, I was willing to fight for my, well, I thought which was my country, and obviously it's not.
The city of Bristol is a place where different memories vie for supremacy. But why can't there be a past we all can embrace? I'm a proud northerner, born in Bolton, of Jamaican heritage. But it could be argued Bristol is the place where I came of age. where I got my first job in journalism, the only career I've ever known. Like many West Indians and their descendants living in the UK, my lineage stretches back to Africa and the trade in human bondage, involving ports like Bristol.
Ships loaded with goods would sail from here down to West Africa. They'd then be exchanged for slaves. That human cargo would go across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. There, they'd be exchanged for cotton and sugar and tobacco. That would then sail back to the United Kingdom. The triangular trade and slavery underpinned great wealth, and it's that wealth that helped build cities like Bristol.
The legacy of slavery and the ships that sailed from here is a fractured past for me. This is true for all Britain's West Indians, the children of empire. Asher Craig grew up to become Bristol's deputy mayor.
I'm searching. I want to know who I am, and I may take the DNA test too. I need to pass down this legacy to my own children. They're also kind of on me, like, Mum, we need to know where we come from so that when they're ready to have children, they can kind of pass on that legacy.
Now the end of their journey is near. What will they find in the land they regard as an El Dorado?
Slavery had obliterated one part of their history. Now West Indians were being encouraged to create another, asked to help rebuild Britain after the war. Mike Lord was a schoolboy, a little too old to be carried over England's threshold when he arrived in 1960, one of the Windrush generation. Like this child, he was barely out of short pants.
Well, I was crying my eyes out. I just didn't want to come to the UK. I was only 6 years of age.
The new arrivals were construction workers, bus drivers. They joined the NHS. Mike arrived on his godparents' passport with no other paperwork. Years later, when he was forced to prove he had a right to live here, he couldn't.
I felt like a leper. I just well had a tag on my back saying I'm not British, because no one will accept it, because the government made it not to employ you if you've got no paperwork to prove who you are.
Slavery, Windrush, toxic legacies of empire, history written by the victors. But this empty plinth tells a new story, that the marginalised have had enough. Last month, the statue of the 18th century slave trader and philanthropist Edward Colston was toppled in the heart of Bristol. Now he awaits restoration, but the graffiti is to be preserved. Symbol of a new understanding that the experience of victor and vanquished are part of the same story.
Well, this is one history that's been brought low, covered in mud, by people who are hoping to create a new history. But the fact is, both our faces represent Bristol.
I think nobody owns history, no one race, no one group owns history. And I'd like for us to start thinking about history in a collective sense. We should think of history as a British history. And that, I think, will encourage people to feel British, that feel that they have a stake in British society.
British colonialism defines who we all are. It's left a family album of different peoples and races. It is our story, every single moment. Clive Myrie, BBC News, in Bristol.
And we'll have more from the series later this week when Fergal Keane will be reporting from Ireland. But that's it from Focus on Africa for today. Thanks for watching. See you again soon.